Brian Lauritzen of KUSC and an avid classical music fan, you are participating in Chamber Music Los Angeles's Music Box 2023. I'm glad we could have some time to talk about that.
It's great to be with you. Thanks for having me.
Of course. What excites you most about Music Box 2023, and how do you think that excitement will translate to audiences who are lucky enough to be there?
I think it's such a cool thing. First of all, just the idea of various chamber music organizations here in Los Angeles, like coming together, to me is really exciting. Working together, sharing audiences, trying to find folks who, like someone comes to Jacaranda and they might learn about Celestina because they're at this event. I think that's, the spirit of chamber music, the spirit of coming together and of musical discovery. And then the other thing that really excites me about this particular program is that it's about the string quartet, which is to chamber music what the symphony is to orchestral music. Like, it is the peak genre. It's the pinnacle of what chamber music is. Every composer who tried to write seriously for chamber music, for chamber musicians, wrote a string quartet, and generally you find in their string quartets some of their most serious, thoughtful, probing, artistic, however you want to describe it, music within that structure. So to explore different eras and different styles of the string quartet, I think is the thing that I'm most looking forward to.
Now, you talked about the idea of sharing audiences and ensembles being heard from people who may not necessarily know about them. What do you hope long-term the benefit is of these ensembles coming together, and what does that portend for the future of them as individual ensembles and then for chamber music in Los Angeles?
Yeah, I mean, the challenge in Los Angeles, of course, is our geographical footprint is so large. And so, like, if you're a West Sider, you don't want to come, I don't know, east of the 405 or east of La Cienega, or you don't want to come downtown a lot of times if you're a West Sider. If you're like me in Pasadena, it's like, oh God, I have to go to Santa Monica for that show? No, I guess not today. Like, and so I think what this can do is connect people to organizations that they may not, just out of the ordinary routine of their lives, encounter. And you may say, like, oh yeah, I wasn't a Jacaranda audience member, but now I am going to go to Santa Monica. I'm going to check them out. They've got this amazing Schoenberg, the whole celebration this year. Like, yeah, I'm in for that. Or, like, I mean, Celestina, which I work with on a regular basis and have for more than a decade. We do a West Side concert and an East Side concert, and so we try to tackle that that geographical challenge as best we can. But I think that's part of what this kind of organization and this kind of collaboration can bring. And I'm just so excited about it because, I mean, we should, like, these organizations shouldn't be competing with one another for audiences. We should be working together with one another, and that's what Chamber Music LA has really fostered. And that's, is Warner Henry's vision, and just such I think an important element within the Los Angeles music making scene. So I think geography is the biggest challenge, and people don't want to leave their zone of comfort and safety. And but we would do it for great performances, and I think this is a showcase of, like, oh, here's why I might leave my usual radius.
Right, but let's take the Mozart, which opens the program.
Mm-hmm.
If all four institutions that are playing play that same Mozart, would a casual listener be able to discern a difference between how each one of them played that piece of music, or any of the pieces of music for that matter that are on the program?
What a great question. I love this question because it speaks to an element of virtuosity that is, I think, not talked about all that often. So like, what is virtuosity? We think about virtuosity as like someone gets up in front of an audience and does something on a violin or a cello or whatever that seems humanly impossible. That's one element of virtuosity. Another element of virtuosity is an interpretive element. So for like, actually, this would be a cool thing for Chamber Music LA to do sometime, is everybody plays the same piece. Because then you can find out, like, and I think even the casual listener would notice a difference, and it might be something that you see. Like, again, it doesn't have to be necessarily like, oh, they held that fermata on that certain chord a little longer than the other group. No, it might just be the way that you watch musicians communicating with one another, which is another of the thrills of live performance. But yeah, to answer your question, I did a long answer, which is I tend to do. I think, yes, people would be able to notice a difference, even if maybe they couldn't put the words on it. Like, I think you would witness it, and you would maybe say like, oh, I liked that one better than that one, and I can't really explain why. And that's one of the things that I love doing in my career is like, let's talk about the why. So tell me what you heard, and what you heard isn't wrong. Like, there's no wrong way to listen to music, right? So what you heard, tell me what you heard, and then I can help interpret, like, oh, that's interesting. So you really liked that component of that particular performance, and you didn't like this component of this particular performance. So yes, I think people would be able to tell a difference, and I think it's a cool showcase of the incredible artistry of the awesome musicians that we're privileged to encounter here in Los Angeles.
You realize you did just make an argument for listening to music is like wine tasting.
We're speaking prior to noon, so I can't crack open my favorite bottle. I mean, I guess I could, because again, what's the harm? But yes, absolutely. And I, as a big wine fan myself, like, I think about this a lot when we go wine tasting across California.
Yeah, and you do realize it's happy hour somewhere.
Thank you. I'll take a sip of my coffee just to,
Yeah, I have sparkling water. So
good for you.
Yeah. So you've already mentioned that you've worked with Celestina for
Yeah.
over a decade, and you do something as part of this program called Sounds Mysterious, where they are given a piece of music without knowing who wrote it or what it is. And it's up to them and the audience to try to figure out what that piece of music is. But I know they're great musicians, but they're not cold reading this, are they?
Oh no, so what I did is I get the sheet music, and then so they all play off iPads electronically. So I have the PDF of the sheet music, and I go into my PDF editor and I literally scribble over, I redact the title and the composer, and then I even look around the margins, like, who published this music. So I scribble that out. Was it a French publishing company, or an English, or an American? Like, so I take out anything that I think can be an identifying feature, and I redact all of that, and then I send them the PDFs, and they load it up, and they're rehearsing it, probably as we speak here, a week ahead of the concert. So it's not a sight reading situation, but they don't know any contextual information about the music, which also we've talked about makes the rehearsal process kind of complicated. Because, like, if you know that it's a certain composer, then okay, so when it's Mendelssohn, like, this is what an accent means. When it's Bartok, here's what you do with the pizzicato. Like, and they don't have any of those contextual pieces of information, so they can only look at the notes, they can only look at the score as their guide. And that, to me, is one of the real joys of this concert format, is you're stripping away everything. You're stripping away all of our preconceptions about what a piece is, about what a composer meant. You don't know. All you know is the notes that are on the page. All you know is the score. And so you have to go from that. And so it really challenges the musicians' brains as well to say, like, we don't have any contextual information. All we have are the notes. What do we make of this? And then
So
how do
what's
we
the
make it compelling?
so what's the criteria you use in selecting that mystery piece of music?
Yeah, so I've done a couple of different options in the past where I'm interested in both an unknown piece of music by a famous composer and a really awesome piece by an unknown composer. Those are like kind of the two extremes of the spectrum. And yes, it's a spectrum, everything's a spectrum. Um, those are the two extremes from which I start to sort of pick music. I don't want it to be a bad piece of music. And again, I don't really believe that there's a lot of bad music out there. I think there's two kinds of music: music that you like and music that you don't like. Um, and if you don't like it, that doesn't mean that it's bad. Someone else might like that piece that you don't like. However, I'm looking for music that like structurally hangs together. I'm looking for music that we can hear it and we can identify things about this music that might give us a clue to what it is. I'm not really super trying to trip people up. I'm not trying to find a piece that makes you think it's by someone and then it's actually like crazy something else. That being said, the last one that we did of these was actually the final Celestina concert prior to the pandemic shutdown in February of 2020. Um, and the piece was a piano quintet by a very, very, very young Bela Bartok. Does not sound like Bartok at all. It's like lush, thick, romantic, beautiful, gorgeous music. And so I thought that would be a fun one to try to see if we can identify, like, is that like this is early 20th century, late romantic, post romantic, whatever. Like, can we get to the fact that it's actually like this composer we know for a completely different sound world? Um, and I was super impressed because the musicians guessed it. Um, and they said that there were some identifying characteristics to it. There was some really, they called it Hungarian elements to the music that they picked up on, and they thought, huh, this can't be Liszt because it's too complex. And there's not a lot of other Hungarian composers out there. So we're gonna guess that it's like early Bartok. And I was shocked like that they got it. And but you know, they're the ones with the deep musical knowledge and history and education and everything, and they got it. So we'll see if I can trip them up this time.
Well, it would seem to me that going with an early work by a composer is probably your best bet, because that's when the composer is first forming their ideas and their structures and the way they want to express themselves. So the later pieces, we're more familiar with that body of work overall, wouldn't we be?
Yeah, and that's a good point too. And in the case of what we're going to hear this weekend, um, well, I don't want to give anything away. It may or may not be an early hit, but yes,
Sure.
you're right that like an early composer early on in his or her career is really sort of finding their own musical language, and that would at least I thought it would make it more difficult for them, but they, you know, the musicians got it, and I was really impressed.
Well, since you and I shared a box at the Hollywood Bowl for John
Yes,
Williams, I did see that John Williams wrote a string quartet for his score for Jane Eyre.
yep, that he did.
So I was that's too short a piece because it's 2 minutes and 40 seconds, and I assume you want something that has a little more meat on the bones. Both
Yeah,
fun to
so I
have.
will say, yeah, I will say it's a single movement of a string quartet by someone other than John Williams.
You've really
That
narrowed it
said,
down.
yeah, I really narrowed it down. That said, John Williams also has written a quartet. It's not a string quartet, so it doesn't fit for this format, but he wrote a quartet for, oh gosh, now I'm blanking. There's a clarinet and a harp and I think two stringed instruments, but it might be one stringed instrument and a piano. I can't remember the precise instrumentation, but it's a woodwind instrument, harp, definitely, at least one string instrument, and maybe a piano. And I've really, really thought about using that for this concert format because it doesn't at all sound like John Williams in the least, and it would probably be a real mystery. And then when you get to the reveal, that's the other fun part about this is like, especially if it's a famous composer that you hadn't thought that they had written this kind of music before, then you're like, oh yeah, no, that's actually John Williams. What? Really? Like, or, and the flip side of this is, and this is why I like these two extremes, like, wait, that music that I just really enjoyed was written by someone I've literally never heard of. Okay, now I got to go find more of their music to discover, and that the discovery is part of one of the key components of this kind of concert format, because there's no possible way that any of us is going to be able to listen to all of the music that has ever been written. There will always be stuff for us to discover, and you think about your favorite pieces of music as you go throughout your life, and like, do you remember the first time you heard that favorite symphony, like Beethoven's Fifth, maybe? Like, what, you remember the first time you heard that favorite piece of music of yours? What an amazing moment of discovery. And so discovery is really like the main component of what we're doing here with the Sounds Mysterious. We want to strip away anything that you think you might feel about the composer or the piece or the era or the country or whatever, and just leave it to the music. Let's let the music tell us what we feel, tell us what we think about what we're hearing.
As somebody who embraces music, classical music in Los Angeles, what do you feel the state of classical music is in Los Angeles right now?
That's a great question. I'm ever an optimist. I think it's a vibrant scene. We've got our really wonderful large companies doing amazing things. Of course, the Los Angeles Philharmonic is, just ask the New York Times. It's the most important orchestra in the United States. Like, and I do believe that. Like, they're right about that. They're doing more interesting things than any other orchestra in this country, probably on planet Earth too. And that's great. And that's not just because of Gustavo, although Gustavo is awesome. And yes, we still have 3 more years of him, so let's not be too sad. And whoever they get next is going to be great too. So from the largest company in the city all the way down to the smallest chamber music organization, like, look, we've got some of the best musicians on planet Earth here in Los Angeles as well. Like, we have to, because of the dominant industry that runs this town, the film industry. The music that's written for film and television demands greatness from the musicians, and they deliver every single time. They deliver. And so, for me, I look, of course, organizationally, like, it's important to be a well-run organization. It's important to not run deficits. It's important to do what you can to keep your organization functional. And it really, so much of that, beyond the management side of it, so much of it depends on the greatness of the musicians. And I'm in awe of the incredible artistry of the amazing musicians of this town. And so that's why I'm just like, anytime I go to a chamber music concert, I'm like, even if if I don't know who the organization is, I'm like, oh, this is a new group, cool. Like, oh, this is a musician I haven't heard before. And then I read their bio and I'm like, oh yeah, so they're in the orchestra for like Star Wars and all the Pixar films and like The Simpsons and like whatever. Like, oh yeah, no. So these musicians, it comes down to the musicians. And if the music making wasn't great, then the organizations wouldn't work out. So tip of the cap to the greatness of the musicians, really. And that's where it all starts, in my opinion.
But organizations of all sizes, whether it's in Los Angeles or across the country and probably across the world, are having a hard time getting
Yeah.
audiences to come back.
Yep.
And even one of the ensembles that's playing as part of Music Box, Jacaranda, is not going to be in existence at the end of this upcoming season.
Yep.
So, the million-dollar question is, what will it take to get audiences back? What will it take for people to embrace the collective experience of hearing music together? What are your thoughts about, some ways that might happen, or how can you help that happen, whether that's on air on
Hmm.
KUSC or
Hmm.
elsewhere?
Yeah, and that is, you're right. It's the million-dollar question, and it's so sad. I've been a Jacaranda fan for as long as I've lived here in Los Angeles. I've been here for 17 years, and this is their 20th season, and sadly, this is their last season, and I'm going to miss them. And Patrick has done such a great job for all these years. Patrick Scott, the founder and executive director of Jacaranda, has done such an incredible job with this organization that has like just been curious about music and never afraid to, I don't even like saying this, but take risks with the programming. So yes, it's a challenge. And I was just reading yesterday about the Philadelphia orchestra musicians they've authorized a strike for various reasons, and part of the reason that management has said like we can't raise your pay is that audience levels are at 64%, and before the pandemic they were at 75%. So something has to change, as you say, to bring those audience levels back. And you hit on a key component of it, and that the first thing in my opinion is community, right? So what did we miss the most when we were all at home, isolating from one another? We missed that collective experience of the joy of sitting in the same space together and experiencing music. As I was here in my home watching YouTube videos, of performances, I said the thing that I miss the most is not the giant loud explosion of a big orchestra making a huge sound. The thing that I miss the most is a giant orchestra of 100+ musicians playing as softly as possible, because there's an electricity in that sound of 115 people, the violin players with one bow hair on the string, and there's that heft to the sound of almost inaudibility in a space that you're sharing with 2,000 people, where people are trying to breathe as quietly as possible. There's something there that you cannot experience anywhere else but in that space. And that's part of what we can do to bring people back, is remind people that yes, there's great resources online, and yes, we can watch anything that we want to watch and listen to anything that we want to listen to, but there's that kind of electric experience excuse me, that you're sharing this space with your friends and neighbors and people that you don't know, and people that you might get to know afterwards when you sit around and talk about what you've experienced. That's part of it. And then sorry. And then the other component for me is storytelling. And I say this as a storyteller, so I'm trying not to be too self-serving here, but classical music is complicated. Classical music is complex. Classical music has a high entry point, and I don't believe that it should. And so, who I am in the world of classical music is someone who says, you may think that it's a difficult entry point, but here's how it's easy. And here's how this music that you may think is not extremely approachable in everyday life, here's how this music actually is approachable in everyday life. Here's how this thing that Beethoven did that we think is this grand and glorious thing, yes, is the grand and glorious thing, but it also relates to what we experience every day in our world, both here in Los Angeles and wherever you are. And so I think, like, for organizations to bring back audiences, it's a combination of reminding folks how incredibly joyful a concert experience is. And then also, once they get there, then giving them the context and the relevance and, you know, the kind of the emotional experience that a classical music concert can be.
As you're saying this, Brian, I'm thinking that we need to find a contemporary equivalent of Bugs Bunny. And I'm
Absolutely.
not being sarcastic with that. But I mean, a lot of people found their way into classical music because it was employed in Looney Tunes cartoons. And of course,
Yeah.
famously by Disney and Fantasia.
Yep. Yeah. And so I'm sort of in that space in between where I don't know what young kids are watching these days that could like benefit from an infusion of classical music, but that is one way in. That said, you mentioned Bugs Bunny, and one of these cartoons, like from the 1940s and 50s, and I'm thinking back a couple of years ago to, well, actually, no, it was not this year, but last year's John Williams show. The first half, I think it was David Newman was conducting the first half, and a couple of the pieces on the first half were Looney Tunes cartoons. And I'm literally sitting in a box behind a family that has a like a 2-year-old and a 4-year-old, and they are cracking up at Bugs Bunny playing Liszt's Hungarian Rhapsody #2. And I'm like, okay, so is this from 1940 whatever or 1950 whatever? I don't know the date off the top of my head. And a kid in 2022 thinks it's hilarious. So maybe they're not as dated as us old people, as adults think. Like maybe like Bugs Bunny and Tom and Jerry and these old cartoons like still have this like kind of timeless staying power. Like I believe classical music has a timeless staying power.
Absolutely. Now, as someone who hosts pre-concert talks and you know, you have a radio show, so you have a platform. I know you do a lot of thinking about what's going on. What's the one thing that's most top of mind for you as it relates to presenting classical music, either over the airwaves or in person?
Why this piece now? That's it. For me, like my job is to share with you why I think it's important that we all experience this particular piece of music right now. So a lot of that comes down to, how do I connect the story behind this particular piece of music to today? How do I show that this music that may be 200 or 300 years old is still relevant in 2023? Why this music now? That's it. And my pursuit is to identify the why and give an answer to either an audience at a pre-concert talk or hosting a concert on stage or on the radio that meets people meets people where they are and invites them into the experience, and doesn't talk down to them, doesn't like, I'm not trying to teach you a lot about music, although in the process I hope you do learn something, because that is one thing that, especially on KUSC, we hear from our audiences, oh, we love learning about the music. Like, yes, that's very important. I start from the standpoint of, I want to tell you a story that's going to entertain you. I want to tell you a story that's going to connect with where you are right now. And then in the process, yeah, of course, we're going to learn something about the music. We're going to hear information probably that we didn't know before. And that's great too. But why this music now?
Right. Well, let me finish by asking about something that Arnold Schoenberg is quoted as having said. Since Schoenberg's music is the penultimate work on this program,
Yes.
and the first work is Mozart, I found this particularly appropriate. He said, "The way in which I write for string quartet, that none can deny that I have learned this directly from Mozart."
I love it.
We have a through line that concert is going to realize of Schoenberg's idea. So looking forward, what do you think the through line will be? Because Schoenberg died in 1951, so he's been gone for quite a while. But what do you
Yeah.
think the through line as a sequel to this would be, say 25 years, 50 years in the future, if we continued from Schoenberg forward?
Yeah, that's a great question too, because I think like one of the components that I love the most about classical music is that there are these connection points along the way, right? Like we only know about Bach because Mendelssohn came 100 years after Bach and was like, "Hey, this guy that you all forgot about, like his music's pretty good. Should we listen to some of it? Let's play it." And then all of a sudden, everyone's like, "Oh yeah, Bach's music is good." Bach could have been lost to history if not for Mendelssohn. Mozart is a through line. Mozart was Tchaikovsky's favorite composer. He called Mozart the musical Christ and paid homage to Mozart in multiple pieces of his. Schoenberg similarly. And so there are these connection points throughout history. John Adams, California composer who is now sort of the elder statesman of American music, talks about this as well. And he talks about how his music is influenced by multiple composers throughout history. And John Adams says one of the coolest things about classical music is that it doesn't live in a tiny window of time like pop music does. And to me, that's not speaking disparagingly of pop music, because I think pop music is important and is a real harbinger of what culture is in a specific time and place. But you listen back to pop music from 20 years ago and it sounds like it's 20 years old. You listen back to pop music from 40 years ago and it sounds like it sounds of its time and place. And classical music does to a certain extent, because you can hear like, oh, this is early 20th century music. Oh, this is late romantic music, late 19th century. Oh, Mozart sounds like Mozart's time, that sort of thing. Baroque music sounds like Baroque music. But there's a wider berth, I think, of timeliness within the realm of classical music. And so classical music should always be looking forward, in my opinion. Classical music should always be creating something new. While looking back to the past, of course, and not dishonoring the past, but what do we love about the great composers in history? We love Beethoven because Beethoven changed everything. We love Mahler because Mahler said, like, everyone's done everything with symphonies except this thing, and then Mahler blew everything up and created symphonies that no one had created before. So classical music is at its best when it's looking forward, when it's looking to what hasn't been done yet, while still recognizing that there is this rich tradition and history, and that as a composer or a musician, you're part of this thing that's bigger than yourself.
Absolutely. Well, as you're saying this, I'm thinking of so many different composers that we're not going to be around long enough to know whether a Thomas Otis is going to have the impact that I think he should have,
Totally.
or
Andrew
anyone
Norman,
else for that matter.
Kaya Sarayaho. The thing, like Kaya Sarayaho, I think about her a lot when I think about these topics, because like every time I hear a piece of her music, I hear a sound that I've never heard before. And she had a way of creating sounds that hadn't been created before. Andrew Norman does this too, to a certain extent. And yeah, Tom Addis as well. These are like sort of the great leading lights of us moving forward into the future. But yeah, who's creating something that we haven't heard before? And it doesn't mean that it has to be like thorny and dissonant or ugly or whatever, and maybe it is, and that's fine too. But like, are you creating something that hasn't been done before? Because that's what Beethoven did, that's what Mozart did, that's what Bach did, and that's what composers today are still doing.
And that's why we love classical music.
100%.